Um, Probably the most important part for 103B. So I'm going to walk you through this quite slowly, and I'm hoping that this makes sense. Again, I'm sorry if this becomes a really long video. I'm really hoping that it's not. Okay, so ANS is autonomic nervous system, and I want you to first look at this in the context of the entire nervous system, right? So if you look at the peripheral nervous system division, it's a big division, right? You've got the sensory, which is the afferent, and notice the arrow, right? So this sends signals to the brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system receives the signals, the red, from the central nervous system and moves it down along several divisions, right? So in general, the motor division is responsible for taking signals to the targets, and both sensory and motor comprise the peripheral nervous system, right? So the motor division is comprised of two. You already saw the somatic nervous system. We already went over this quite a bit when we did skeletal muscle. We did it when we did reflexes, right? So a lot of these divisions effects we have seen, almost all of them. We're going to now focus, as is highlighted in orange, on the autonomic nervous system. The word autonomic means automatic, right? We don't have really any conscious control over autonomic nervous system, right? And that is divided into two main divisions. You've got the sympathetic division and you've got the parasympathetic division. And throughout this class, what we're going to do for this portion, we're going to be looking at both anatomical and functional differences, right? So sympathetic is really your fight, flight, fright response, right? So fighting, okay, getting scared, right, and running away, right? So that kind of combination, right, that will be your sympathetic division. And typically anything that's life-threatening, the sympathetic immediately gets turned on. So think about this, guys. Anytime there's some sort of an initiation of a reflex that involves anything life-threatening, right, sympathetic will get turned on. For instance, let's say you step on a thumbtack or something. Immediately your heart starts racing, you start sweating, right? You become kind of rattled, right? That all has to do with the sympathetic response. Parasympathetic division deals with rest and digest. Now, of course, when it comes to the reproductive system, sympathetic and parasympathetic work together. But for the most part, sympathetic and parasympathetic are antagonistic. They do opposite effects on targets. It's also important to mention here that in terms of sympathetic and parasympathetic, many, in fact, most targets are dually innervated, meaning they both have sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers. But there are examples where you only have one or the other. That's called single innervation or singly innervated, right? There you only have one response. And you've already seen an example of this. Remember, in the skin, erector pili responds to sympathetic activation, right? And erector pili does not have parasympathetic in its as its efferent. And another example are blood vessels. The smooth muscle in blood vessels, and this is going to be important for B. The smooth muscle in blood vessels are only innervated by sympathetic fibers, not parasympathetic. So that's another really important point. Cardiac muscle is only innervated by sympathetic, and by that I mean contractile cardiac muscle, not by parasympathetic. Okay. So when you compare autonomic in general with the somatic, again, remember, the somatic nervous system innervates skeletal muscle, right? And it's voluntary response. But autonomic innervates smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. And again, contractile cardiac muscle, and of course, it innervates glands. And typically, the autonomic nervous system, the ganglia are really, really important. And remember the definition of ganglia. These are, collections of neural cell bodies outside the central nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is much more persistent in its effects, right? Because of indirect neurotransmitter mechanisms. So almost exclusively, autonomic nervous system effects are indirect neurotransmitter mechanisms, meaning these are not ligand-gated ion channels, right? Remember, we went over neurotransmitters in that chapter. Indirect basically means that the neurotransmitter binds and activates a series of proteins, which will eventually have an effect. So in other words, you have a detailed signal transduction. Because of this indirect response, the autonomic nervous system has a much slower effect compared to the somatic nervous system, and it is multisynaptic, right? And typically smaller, often unmyelinated axons. Remember, if you don't have unmyelinated axon, if you don't have myelin in your axons, you're going to end up doing what's called continuous conduction. And continuous conduction is very slow, right? You're not skipping over large areas. You're going through every area of the membrane. And the slow response is due to multisynaptic, unmyelinated axons and indirect neurotransmitter action in the target. Okay, so what are some of the similarities? They both belong to the response division. They're both efferent pathways. They both innervate some form of muscle. And in both, acetylcholine is a key neurotransmitter. And remember, acetylcholine is required in all autonomic ganglia, right? Whether you are activating sympathetic nervous system or parasympathetic nervous system, acetylcholine is what does that. Okay, and the axons emerge via cranial and spinal nerves, just like somatic nervous system. So this table is extremely important. These are anatomical mainly anatomical differences. And I'm going to go through these in detail, okay? And typically, the origin, right, parasympathetic origins are craniosacral outflow. That means, you have the origins in the cranium, in the brain, as well as in the sacrum. Now, just because you're involving the cranium, brainstem nuclei, you're dealing with some level of cognition, right? If you involve the brain, you're definitely dealing with some sort of cognition. And remember, parasympathetic is rest and digest. How can you rest unless you recognize a particular area to be safe, right? Nobody's going to be, watching some kind of show on their cell phone in the middle of a forest, right? It's a very scary situation. So you cannot rest and watch your TV unless you feel safe in your room, right? Sympathetic, on the other hand, is thoracolumbar. So the sympathetic ganglia are arranged beautifully near the spinal cord, and this is called the paravertebral column, right? And it's right next to the spinal cord, right? And makes sense because spinal cord receives a lot of reflex action, right? And that immediately gets communicated to the sympathetic nervous system, especially if the reflex is life-threatening. And the chain ganglia, right? The fact that the sympathetic ganglia are chain ganglia really is important because they're all interconnected. So when you activate one ganglion, you're activating all of them. Think about it. If it's a life-threatening illness or life-threatening situation, remember, it's important to have a very amplified turning on of the whole body alarm, right? And this connection of these ganglia makes sure that you have a very persistent and a very strong response. On the other hand, parasympathetic ganglia are terminal, right? They're kind of scattered, and they're usually found right near the target organ, whereas sympathetic ganglia are found really far away from the target organ. Think about it. One of the main targets is the heart, right? Parasympathetic ganglia are found right near the heart, whereas sympathetic ganglia are found all the way around the body near the spinal cord, right? So that's an example, which makes the next row really common sense, right? Because parasympathetic ganglia are found near the target organ, the connection between the central nervous system and the parasympathetic ganglia is going to be a really long one, right? And then the postganglionic, that's going from the ganglion to the target organ, is going to be really short because the ganglia is situated right near the target. Sympathetic is the exact opposite. You have a very short preganglionic because the spinal cord's right there. And the nucleus of the preganglionic neuron is going to be found in the middle portion, right, of the ventral horn, right? Remember the visceromotor, right, area? And it's going to have a very long postganglionic. Now, Raymi communicantes are basically connections, right, between the ganglia. Now, clearly, parasympathetic don't have that kind of connection, right? The ganglia are far apart. They're found in far corners of the body. Sympathetic, they're all connected, okay, through Raymi communicantes, right? And you have white Raymi are, of course, myelinated, and gray Raymi are not myelinated, right? So the color kind of gives it away. Degree of branching, parasympathetic is very minimum branching, right? Sympathetic is your alarm call. It is going to be very extensively branched. It makes sense it's extensively branched. So in terms of the functional role, like I said, parasympathetic is rest and digest. Sympathetic is fight or flight, and also, they have responses in the reproductive system, which we'll see in a few minutes. In terms of neurotransmitters, all preganglionic, postganglionic release acetylcholine, right, for parasympathetic, whereas preganglionic release acetylcholine, but postganglionic release norepinephrine. Now, epinephrine is a hormone because it's secreted directly into blood from the adrenal medulla. Now, in terms of, again, I wanted to quickly go over this before I went into the actual effects. So this is somatic, right? Already we dealt with that, and it's always stimulatory. Autonomic, so this is your central nervous system, right, here. So notice the cell bodies are here, and the ganglia are very close. So you have a very short preganglionic fiber, and then the postganglionic, right, is going to be really long, and it releases norepinephrine. And adrenal gland releases epinephrine or norepinephrine into blood. Parasympathetic, the ganglion is situated really far, so the preganglionic is really long, and the postganglionic is quite unmyelinated and situated very much near the target, and it releases acetylcholine in both places. And remember, these can be stimulatory or inhibitory based on the receptors. This is really crucial. I want you to, again, understand, I mentioned this when we did neurotransmitters, that neurotransmitters action, the same neurotransmitter can have completely opposite actions in different targets because they have different receptors. So please understand that's very important. Also, in the ganglion, acetylcholine is very direct and nicotinic. It's a very quick response, just like skeletal muscle. So again, this is just notes, okay? The indirect mechanism for acetylcholine is through muscarinic receptors. The direct acting is nicotinic, okay? And they're both called cholinergic receptors. It's a very quick response, just like skeletal muscle. So again, this is just notes, okay? The indirect mechanism for acetylcholine is through muscarinic receptors. The direct acting is nicotinic, okay? And they're both called cholinergic receptors for acetylcholine, okay? And then this is, again, the notes on sympathetic nervous system. I've already gone over all of these, right? Trying to see if I have a different kind of table. So these sympathetic receptors, I do need you to know all of these receptors, alpha 1, beta 2, and then beta 3 and alpha 2. So there are 3 beta receptors and 2 alpha receptors. This is going to be really, really important in 103B. So please know this, and I will test you on this semester. So make sure you know this, okay? And here's nicotinic versus muscarinic receptors and how they work, okay? Yeah, it doesn't look like I have any other cables, sorry. I'll get back to here, and let's look at some of these effects. Okay. So I want to go through all the parasympathetic effects first. So remember, parasympathetic is rest or digest, right? So you're feeling really safe. You're sitting on your couch and you're watching some TV show. Clearly, you're going to fall asleep soon, right? And the same thing happens in a lecture hall, right? Somebody's talking, you know, I'm lecturing, and you're sitting in the lecture hall and you're feeling really safe, right? And you don't have a threat of a pop quiz or a pop exam, so you're feeling nice and comfortable, and I sound like a lullaby, and boom, you know, your eyes close, right? Some of you fall asleep. That's a parasympathetic effect. Right? Parasympathetic makes sure that the light going into the eye is blocked by closing of the eye, and when that happens, you know, the brain is stimulated to fall asleep. Okay, this is why watching cell phones and tablets at night is disastrous, because the amount of radiation that's going through your eyes will block the parasympathetic nervous system from making you feeling sleepy. In terms of the salivary glands, again, it makes sense that the salivary glands are actually stimulated. Okay, so salivary glands are stimulated by the parasympathetic. So in terms of the eye, again, you have pupil constriction. Okay. In terms of the salivary glands, the parasympathetic will stimulate secretion. Right. That's why a lot of people drool when they sleep sometimes. But very importantly, let's say you're, you know, walking on a street and you, you know, peek inside this bakery, or you get this really whiff of this really amazing smell of a cake that you love. Boom, you start salivating. Right. Very interestingly, this also happens when you see, you know, somebody that you find attractive. Right. You do salivate because, again, it's part of the parasympathetic response. And parasympathetic in the genitals, okay, causes erection. And think about it, as an animal, there's no way you're going to have an erection if you're afraid. Now, I know people are going to come at me and say, well, there are a lot of people who have, you know, this horror fetish, right, where being scared turns them on. Please understand that majority of animals do not subscribe to that. And humans do. And I have a feeling that we are evolving in a different direction, okay? But believe me, majority of animals, all animals actually, if you scare them, the last thing they're going to do is they'll have an erection. That is not going to happen. So in terms of the heart, heart rate is slowed down. Heart is made to relax. Basically, in fact, there is a reflex, right, where if you put your hand at your chest on your heart and you rub, and people do this to babies, right? Babies immediately fall asleep when you do that. Or you tap them on their chest, it causes you to go to sleep. This reflex is in adults also. So if you've noticed, right, when you receive really bad news, immediately you clutch your chest, right? And when your hand goes onto the chest, that'll comfort the chest. There's a reflex going on that'll help, that'll activate parasympathetic, and it'll cause your heart to slow down, because you just received really bad news, and you don't want your heart to get that much sympathetic stimulation. So heart rate slows down. Parasympathetic only innervates the pacemaker of the heart. Okay, all the pacemakers. It does not innervate contractile cardiac muscle. In terms of lungs, the parasympathetic causes bronchial constriction. So it causes all the airways to constrict. Again, you know, you're sitting on your couch watching your favorite show. What do you need all that oxygen for? Right? So you have bronchial constriction. Stomach receives very special, because it's part of that digest idea, and so does liver and gallbladder, and also the pancreas. These are all digestive stimulations, and stomach is activated, right, by the parasympathetic nervous system, by the vagus nerve, and that's why when someone has excessive acid reflux, one of the ways people manage this with is surgery, where they go through what's called a vagotomy, where they sever the vagus nerve that's going to the stomach, so you don't produce as much acid. Again, you will learn this gastric reflex in 103B. There's something called short reflexes and long reflexes, and you'll actually do a whole essay on it. Pancreas, basically, you have a stimulation of insulin and all the digestive enzymes, right? Because, again, you're getting ready to digest. This is kind of also important, because this is also why eating food makes you feel safe and relaxed. So there are some diseases associated with that, right? Where people binge eat. They're stressed out. They eat because it calms them down. Liver and gallbladder, same thing, right? They're associated with digestion. And when they say bladder here, you're talking about urinary bladder. right? And the parasympathetic nervous system will stimulate your bladder to push the urine through for voiding, right? So parasympathetic stimulates micturition, or the peeing reflex, and the pons is also involved from the brain, by the way. But parasympathetic is also important because it starts constricting the bladder smooth muscle, forcing you to pee. Now the sympathetic is going to have almost completely the opposite actions. When you're scared, I don't know if you've seen animals in headlights, right? Their pupils just dilate. You get a lot of light in because you're in a very dangerous situation. The last thing you want to do is minimize your field of vision, right? So you need to be able to judge your danger. So your pupil will dilate in response to the sympathetic activation. And to the skin, we saw this, right? There's increased blood flow, and to the skin, okay, and actually the sympathetic nervous system will vasoconstrict blood vessels, I think, in the skin because you're feeling really cold, and simultaneously it will also activate erector pili. So yeah, so not increased blood flow to the skin, decreased blood flow to the skin because of vasoconstriction. Salivary glands are inhibited. This is why when you wake up from a bad dream, your mouth feels really dry because blood is diverted from mouth and all the digestive organs into go into the brain and the muscles, because you're going to need that, right? You're in a fight or flight situation. Lungs, you need a lot more oxygen because you're getting ready to fight, or you're getting ready to run away, for both of which you need a lot of oxygen. So bronchodilation happens in the lungs, and makes sense. This is why you get an epinephrine shot when someone has deadly allergies, because the allergies will cause remember, histamine is a neurotransmitter, will cause the lungs or the airways to shut down. So epinephrine will make the airways to dilate, right? That's why people carry EpiPens. The heart, sympathetic has multiple effects in the heart. It causes the pacemakers to send more signals, electrical signals, and it also causes the contractile cardiac muscle to open more calcium channels. So you know what happens when more calcium goes in, right? Higher contractility. So the heart beats faster, and the heart beats more strongly. Excuse me. The sympathetic nervous system inhibits the pancreas. Again, all digestive processes are inhibited. Same thing with the liver and the gallbladder, and it will stimulate the adrenal gland to release more epinephrine. And with the bladder, urinary bladder that is, sympathetic nervous system will help relax the bladder. So as an animal, it makes sense, right? You don't want to, when you're in danger, you don't want to pee, because the predator can smell the urine and track you down, right? You don't want that to happen. So not only that, there's a danger of slipping and falling when you're running away from danger. That's not good either. And more importantly, you cannot be spending energy on urinating, right? So sympathetic nervous system inhibits urination. And in the genitals, it's really interesting. If the parasympathetic causes erection, then the sympathetic finishes the job off through ejaculation in both males and females. Okay, so sympathetic causes ejaculation in both males and females. And with that, this lecture is done. So please go through this lecture very carefully. It is really, really important, and it's crucial for 103B. So please make sure you're really, really comfortable with not only the anatomy and the receptors, but also all the physiological effects. Okay. So the nerve system is done. I will meet you in the endocrine system next. Actually, before I finish off, I really did want to quickly mention that the hypothalamus is a major control center for the autonomic nervous system. Okay, it's really important. The medulla also has nuclei that help regulate a lot of the sympathetic effects, and but the hypothalamus is really the master for the ANS.